You're watching Northern Crimes.
The Pacific Northwest is a place of contrasts. Towering evergreens stretch toward the sky, their dark silhouettes framing mist-covered mountains. Rushing rivers carve through deep valleys, while quiet logging roads disappear into the wilderness. It's a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving, a place where the solitude of nature can feel peaceful one moment and ominous the next. Tucked within this vast expanse is Snohomish County, Washington, a region known for its rugged landscapes, small towns, and sprawling forests. But for all its quiet charm, something dark lingers in the air, a history of violence. For decades, bodies have surfaced in its woods, its ravines, its forgotten back roads. Victims whose last moments were stolen in the dead of night. Their killers, some lurking in plain sight, others vanishing without a trace, left behind questions that would haunt investigators for years. Some cases remained mysteries for decades, their answers buried beneath layers of time. Others were solved only through sheer determination and the breakthroughs of forensic science. But in every case, one truth remains. Evil can hide anywhere, even here. This is the true story of the Snohomish Murders, and this is Northern Crimes. August 23, 1972, Bothell, Washington. The afternoon sun filters through the trees as 20-year-old Jody Loomis pedals along a quiet road, tires of her bike kicking up dust on the rural path. She's heading to the stable to visit her horse, a trip she's made countless times before. The wooded trails feel familiar, safe. But today, someone is watching. Somehow, a pleasant afternoon turns to terror. Jody never makes it to the stable. Hours later, a couple out target shooting stumbles upon a horrifying sight. Her body discarded in the woods. Her life taken in a brutal and senseless attack. Her murder will remain unsolved for nearly 5 decades. Who crossed her path that day? And how did her killer walk free for so long, hiding in plain sight? From the moment Jody Loomis could walk, she was drawn to horses. She spent hours at the stable, brushing their coats, talking to them gently. It was her escape, her passion. She had big dreams, but for now, she was content riding the back roads of Bothell, Washington, where she lived with her family. Jody was adventurous, independent, and full of life. She was the kind of person who made an impression, kind to animals, fiercely determined, and unafraid to carve her own path. But in one violent moment, all that came to an end. On August 23, 1972, Jody set off on her bike toward Strum Road, where her horse was kept. Around 5 p.m., she was last seen crossing the Bothell-Everett Highway, pedaling up Penny Creek Road, now Mill Creek Road. Somewhere along the route, she met her killer. Less than 30 minutes later, a couple out target shooting in the woods made a gruesome discovery. Jody was found partially clothed, suffering from a gunshot wound to the head. She was rushed to Stevens Memorial Hospital, but it was too late. Jody Loomis was pronounced dead. Investigators found no murder weapon, no witnesses, no immediate suspects. The case stalled, and over time, it grew cold. For decades, Jody's case remained a mystery. Investigators had collected biological evidence, but DNA technology was still in its infancy. Leads dried up, time passed, the case faded into history. Then, in 2008, forensic advancements changed everything. A crime lab technician re-examined Jody's hiking boot and found semen evidence that had gone unnoticed for decades. The DNA was analyzed, but there was no match in national databases. 10 more years passed before detectives turned to a new tool in forensic science, genetic genealogy. In 2018, a private forensic team at Parabon Nanolabs uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. By tracing distant relatives, genealogists built a family tree that led investigators to one man, Terrence Miller, a retired heavy equipment operator who ran a ceramics business with his wife. But Miller wasn't just an ordinary retiree, he had a dark past. Accusations of sexual violence dating back to the 1960s. So detectives placed him under surveillance, and eventually they retrieved a discarded coffee cup from a casino he visited. When the DNA on the cup matched the sample from Jody's boot, the case that had been cold for nearly 50 years was suddenly red hot. In April 2019, Miller, now 77 years old, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Justice was finally within reach. The trial had brought decades of unanswered questions to light. Prosecutors laid out the forensic evidence, investigators recounted their pursuit of the truth, and Jody's family sat in the courtroom, waiting for justice at last. But just hours before the jury could deliver its verdict, on November 9th, 2020, Terrence Miller took his own life. His conviction was announced later that same day. For Jody's family, the verdict confirmed what they'd always believed, but Miller's death meant he would never truly face justice. Jody's case is a testament to the power of forensic science and the frustration of justice delayed. Her murder was finally solved, but how many others remain unanswered, waiting for technology to catch up with the past? August 14th, 1977, Everett, Washington. The scent of wild blackberries lingers in the warm summer air as a group of berry pickers moves through the dense brush. They chat casually, their hands reaching for ripe fruit tangled in the brambles, and then someone stops. A shape lies twisted in the undergrowth. At first, it seems out of place, just another piece of debris discarded in the woods. But as they step closer, the truth becomes horrifyingly clear. A young woman's body, partially concealed in the brush, unrecognizable from decay and violence. There's no ID, no wallet, nothing to hint at who she was or where she came from. For the next 43 years, she'll be known only as Precious Jane Doe, a name given to her by the detectives who refused to forget. But who was she, and why had someone gone to such brutal lengths to erase her identity? Her name was Elizabeth Ann Roberts, but those who knew her called her Lisa. Born in Hood River, Oregon in 1959, Lisa was adopted at age 2 and raised in Roseburg by Troy and Dolly Roberts. She played the flute in her high school band, loved music, and was known for her quiet kindness. At 17 years old, she was at a crossroads. In the summer of 1977, a disagreement with her parents, one of those fleeting arguments that feel monumental in the moment, prompted Lisa to run away from home. Her father reported her as a runaway, but her family believed she would return, and for a moment, it seemed like she might. A few weeks later, Lisa called home from Everett, Washington. She asked for money. Her parents wired her $500 to a local bank, but days passed and she never picked it up. That was the last time anyone heard from Lisa Roberts. Days after making the call, Lisa was last seen hitchhiking along the Bothell-Everett Highway. What happened next would remain a mystery for decades. When her body was discovered on August 14th, investigators had almost nothing to go on. No identification, no missing persons report that matched, and the violence inflicted on her face made recognition impossible. The medical examiner estimated she was between 25 and 35 years old, a miscalculation that would delay her identification for years. Detectives scoured missing persons databases, but there was no match. With no leads, Lisa was buried in an unmarked grave at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in Everett. She became just another Jane Doe, a life without answers, a case without closure. Though Lisa's identity remained a mystery, her killer couldn't keep his crime a secret. In the weeks following the murder, an Everett man bragged to a friend, describing how he'd picked up a hitchhiker, strangled her, then shot her multiple times. His friend was disturbed, so he went to police. Detectives quickly honed in on the suspect, a 20-year-old local man with a history of violence. When they searched his vehicle, they found a .22 caliber rifle, ammunition, and bungee cords, items eerily similar to the ones used in the murder. But there was one problem. They couldn't prove that the young woman he'd confessed to killing was Precious Jane Doe. Months passed before ballistics testing confirmed what detectives suspected. The bullets found in her skull matched his rifle. In January 1979, police arrested the man for murder. His name was David Roth. Later that year, he was convicted and sentenced to 26 years in prison. But as the years progressed, he never revealed her name. Lisa's family had no idea her killer had already been brought to justice, and for decades, the truth remained buried with her. Despite the conviction, investigators never stopped searching for Jane Doe's identity. In 2008, her body was exhumed, and forensic artists created new reconstruction sketches in hopes of sparking recognition, but no one came forward. Then, forensic science caught up to the past. In 2020, Snohomish County detectives turned to genetic genealogy. Forensic experts, including Dr. Barbara Ray Venter, worked to extract DNA from Jane Doe's remains. But there was a problem. Traditional DNA testing required hair roots, and her remains contained only decades-old, rootless hair strands. That's when Dr. Richard Green, a biomolecular engineer, developed a groundbreaking technique, one that could sequence degraded DNA from old hair strands. It worked. Lisa's DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, where genealogists built a family tree. After 43 years, it led them to her biological half-brother. On June 16, 2020, Snohomish County detectives made the announcement. Precious Jane Doe was Lisa Roberts. Lisa's killer had long since served his time, but he never answered for the final cruelty of keeping her nameless for so long. By the time Lisa was identified, David Roth had been dead for 5 years, succumbing to cancer in 2015, on the exact anniversary of the day he murdered her. Lisa's family, both adoptive and biological, was stunned. After 43 years of silence, they finally had an answer. She was laid to rest in Hood River, Oregon, near the loved ones who'd never stopped searching for her. For decades, her name was erased, but science and the relentless pursuit of truth ensured that, in the end, Lisa Roberts got her name back. November 1987, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. The ferry glides across the dark waters, its deck lined with travelers staring out at the endless horizon. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg stand together, wrapped in their own world. They're young, in love, and on a simple errand, picking up furnace parts in Seattle. They don't know it yet, but someone is watching them. Hours later, the ferry docks. Jay and Tanya drive into the city, their bronze 1977 Ford Club van disappearing into the night. They're never seen alive again. Days pass. Their families wait for a call that never comes. Then, one by one, the bodies appear. First Tanya, then Jay. Two crime scenes miles apart, different methods of killing, no clear motive. For over 3 decades, their murders will haunt detectives, confound investigators, and devastate their families. Who killed Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, and why? Jay Cook, 20, and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, 18, were a young Canadian couple from Saanich, British Columbia. They'd been dating for 6 months, their relationship filled with firsts. First road trip, first weekend getaway, first time navigating the world together. Jay was adventurous and hardworking, a kind-hearted young man with a strong sense of responsibility. Tanya was quiet, artistic, and thoughtful, often capturing moments through the lens of her Minolta X700 camera. On November 18, 1987, they set off for Seattle to pick up furnace parts for Jay's father's business. It was supposed to be a quick trip, an overnight journey before heading home, but they never made it back. That evening, Jay and Tanya boarded the MV Coho ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, Washington. A fuel receipt later confirmed they stopped for gas before driving southeast toward Bremerton, where they took a second ferry into Seattle. At some point between leaving the ferry and reaching their destination, they vanished. When they failed to return home, their worried families reported them missing. Days passed with no word, no sightings, no phone calls. Then, the nightmare began. On November 24, 1987, Tanya's body was found discarded in a ditch off Parsons Creek Road near Alger, Washington, an isolated area in Skagit County. She'd been bound with plastic zip ties, assaulted, and shot in the head. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed her. They'd stripped away her dignity, leaving her body exposed to the harsh terrain. The next day, a disturbing clue emerged. In downtown Bellingham, Tanya's wallet, keys, and other belongings were found stuffed under the porch of a Greyhound bus station tavern. Nearby, police discovered Jay's family van, abandoned. Inside, detectives found plastic gloves, zip ties, and receipts confirming the couple's ferry trip. But there was no sign of Jay. 2 days later, that changed. On November 26, 1987, Jay's body was discovered 60 miles away, dumped near a bridge over the Snoqualmie River in Monroe, Washington. Unlike Tanya, he hadn't been shot. Instead, he'd been badly beaten with rocks, strangled, and had a pack of cigarettes stuffed down his throat, a cruel, deliberate act of violence. The crime scenes were far apart, the methods of killing were different, but one thing was clear. This was no random attack. Someone had hunted them, restrained them, and killed them in 2 separate locations. But why? At first, detectives struggled to make sense of the evidence. The zip ties suggested premeditation. The van, abandoned near a bus station, hinted at a planned escape. The plastic gloves left inside were chilling, a sign the killer knew how to avoid leaving prints. Had they picked up a hitchhiker? Had a stranger targeted them on the ferry? As detectives searched for answers, the case took a bizarre turn. In December 1987, Jay and Tanya's families began receiving anonymous letters. They were graphic, taunting, and cruel. Each letter claimed to be from the killer, describing the murders in chilling detail. They were postmarked from Seattle, Los Angeles, and New York, suggesting a twisted game. When detectives tracked down the writer years later, they were shocked by what they found. They'd been written by a mentally ill transient with no connection to the crime. The whole thing had been a hoax, but the real killer was still out there. For years, investigators hit dead ends. They examined over 200 suspects, From convicted felons to known violent offenders, the case remained frozen in time until forensic science finally caught up. In 2003, detectives retested evidence from Tanya's crime scene. Semen found on her clothing was analyzed for DNA, and it belonged to one unknown man. Investigators ran the profile through CODIS, the national DNA database. No match. The killer had left his DNA behind, but he wasn't in the system. For over 30 years, the case remained cold. Then, in 2018, everything changed. That year, detectives watched as the Golden State Killer was unmasked using genetic genealogy. Inspired, like the other cases we've talked about already, they turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a forensic DNA company specializing in genealogical profiling. Using GEDmatch, forensic genealogist C.C. Monroe traced the unknown suspect's DNA to distant relatives, then built a family tree that led to one man, William Earl Talbot II. A truck driver from Washington, Talbot had never been on investigators' radar. Detectives followed him for days, waiting for him to discard anything with his DNA. Finally, on May 8, 2018, he threw away a coffee cup. When forensic scientists tested it, the DNA was a perfect match. After 31 years, detectives had their killer. Talbot was arrested on May 17, 2018, charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder. At trial, he denied any involvement, offering only one defense. If his DNA was on Tanya's clothes, it must have been from consensual sex. But the jury didn't believe him. On July 24, 2019, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. But even in justice, the case took another twist. In December 2021, his conviction was overturned on appeal due to juror bias. One juror admitted she might struggle to remain impartial in cases involving violence against women. The Washington Supreme Court reinstated the verdict in December 2022, and Talbot remains in custody as his legal team fights for further appeals. For 3 decades, Jay and Tanya's families lived with unanswered questions. Jay's mother, Leona Cook, still keeps his old sweater.
Some of us wanted a shirt or sweater. You could wear them. You could put them to your nose and smell him. I still have that old sweater in my drawer.
No conviction can bring back the young couple who set off on a simple road trip and never returned. But after 31 years, their families finally had one thing: a name, a face, and at last, the truth. August 25th, 1990, Snohomish County, Washington. The forest is still. A light breeze rustles the trees as a woman walks her dog along a narrow trail near Highway 522 and Echo Lake Road. It's a quiet, uneventful afternoon until she spots something just off the path. At first, it doesn't register, a shape among the leaves partially covered. Then, the realization hits. It's a human body. The body is identified as Michelle Koski, just 17 years old. She's been beaten, strangled, and left in the dense underbrush, her final moments marked by terror and unimaginable violence. Investigators will spend the next decades trying to piece together what happened to Michelle that night. But for more than 30 years, her killer will remain nothing more than a phantom, an unseen presence in the shadows. Who lured Michelle into these woods, and why was her life stolen so brutally? Michelle Koski was more than just another name in a cold case file. She was bright, ambitious, and full of life. She'd skipped a grade in school and was attending Summit K-12, an alternative school in Seattle where she excelled in her studies. She dreamed of becoming a lawyer, her sharp mind and strong sense of justice making her a natural fit for the field. Her friends described her as someone who lit up every room. She was close with her friends, bonding over sleepovers, games of rummy, and their shared love of Slurpees. To those who knew her, Michelle was funny, independent, and unforgettable. Then, in one night of horror, all that was taken away. In August 1990, Michelle was living at an apartment she shared with her boyfriend in Lake City, Seattle. On August 20th, she got a ride to a popular teenage hangout spot in Snohomish County, a secluded area known for drinking, bonfires, and motorcycle riding. But she never made it home. For 5 days, Michelle's family and friends waited in agony. Then, on August 25th, the discovery was made. Her body was found hidden in the woods, showing clear signs of a brutal attack. She'd been strangled and bludgeoned with a piece of concrete. The location suggested she'd been lured there under false pretenses. Investigators immediately suspected that Michelle knew her killer, but despite an extensive investigation, there were no immediate suspects. The case went cold. For years, cold case detectives pursued every lead, ruling out dozens of suspects through DNA testing. But with no match in the system, the case remained stalled, another mystery lost to time. Then, in 2022, investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy, where they extracted DNA evidence from Michelle's crime scene and uploaded it to public genealogy databases, hoping for a break. They found one. The DNA led to a distant relative of an unknown suspect. From there, genealogists painstakingly built family trees, narrowing their search until they arrived at one name: Robert A. Brooks. Brooks wasn't a stranger to the area or to law enforcement. At the time of Michelle's murder, he'd been living just blocks away from her. He'd recently been released from prison in April 1990 and was staying with family in Seattle. His DNA was a perfect match, but there would be no arrest, no trial, no chance for Michelle's family to confront him in court. Brooks had died in 2016, taking his secrets with him. More than 3 decades after Michelle's murder, her family finally had an answer. On June 30th, 2022, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office publicly announced that Brooks had been identified as Michelle's killer. For her loved ones, it was a mix of relief and frustration. They knew his name, but he wouldn't face justice. Despite that, detectives consider the case solved, another success in the rapidly evolving world of forensic genealogy. Michelle Koski was just 17 years old when her life was stolen. Though justice came far too late, her name will never be forgotten. April 13th, 1993, Bothell, Washington. The quiet suburban street is still, porch lights casting faint halos against the dark. Inside one modest home, the stillness is unnatural. The front door drifts open in the breeze. Just beyond the threshold, the house is in disarray. Furniture is overturned, a glass of milk lies spilled on the floor, the television is off. Melissa Lee is gone. Her mother, arriving home late, calls out for her. No answer. Her shoes are by the door. Her belongings are untouched. Nothing is missing except Melissa. By the next evening, the horrifying truth will emerge. Her lifeless body found beneath a bridge in Everett. For nearly 3 decades, the question will remain unanswered. Who took Melissa Lee's life? And how did her killer vanish without a trace? Melissa Lee was just 15 years old when she disappeared. She was a bright, loving, and spirited girl with her whole future ahead of her. She shared a close bond with her mother and sister, and like many teenagers, she loved music, spending time with friends, and dreaming about what lay ahead. Those who knew her described her as kind, funny, and full of life. On the night of April 13th, 1993, Melissa had planned for a friend to stay over, but at the last minute, the plans fell through. She was home alone, and someone knew it. Sometime after 9 p.m., Melissa vanished. When her mother got home after midnight, she found the house in disarray. The front door ajar, furniture knocked over, the unsettling silence of a home now empty. Authorities were called immediately, but there was no sign of forced entry, no immediate clues to her whereabouts, no witnesses. The next evening, April 14th, Melissa's body was discovered in a ravine beneath the Edgewater Creek Bridge in Everett. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled, her body left like an afterthought, exposed to the elements. Investigators were horrified by the brutality of the crime, but without forensic leads, they were left with nothing but dead ends. From the start, detectives considered several persons of interest. Among them was Alan Edward Dean, a 35-year-old man Melissa had met through a phone chat line. He'd gone by the name, quote, Mike at the time. According to entries in Melissa's diary, the two had met on March 14th, 1993, and gone out for dinner and a theme park visit the following day. Investigators found his phone number written in Melissa's address book under the name Michael, further linking him to the case. But at the time, there was no direct evidence connecting him to the crime. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA matches. The years passed, Melissa's family trapped in the torment of not knowing. And then, in 2020, everything changed. Utilizing forensic genealogy, DNA from the crime scene was analyzed and uploaded to a public genealogy database. Within weeks, investigators had a breakthrough, a match to a relative of the suspect. From there, a family tree was built, leading detectives right back to the man they'd suspected all along, Alan Edward Dean. For 27 years, Dean had lived freely, his crime buried by the limitations of 1990s forensic science. But now, detectives had what they needed. They tailed him, watched him, waiting for him to discard anything with his DNA. Finally, he tossed a cigarette butt. When tested, the results were undeniable, a perfect match to the DNA found on Melissa's body. After nearly 3 decades, police had their killer. In 2024, after years of legal delays, Dean finally stood trial. The jury deliberated for days before delivering a guilty verdict. On April 24, 2024, he was sentenced to 26 years in prison. But even in his final moments in court, Dean refused to admit the truth. In a final act of defiance, he maintained his innocence, claiming he'd been framed and that the DNA had been planted. Melissa's family, who'd waited decades for justice, expressed relief. He'll die in prison. It's what he deserves, her mother said. For years, the forests, backroads, and waterways of Snohomish County concealed their secrets. Lives stolen, killers unpunished, families left with only questions. But the past rarely stays buried. Through decades of dead ends, investigators never stopped searching. As forensic science advanced, long-dormant cases were revived, names reclaimed, shadows exposed, justice, though long overdue, finally served. Yet many mysteries remain. Somewhere in the quiet expanse of the Pacific Northwest, the unknown lingers. Stories waiting to be told, answers waiting to be found. Because the truth never stays hidden forever.